Tokyo, 1944, night over Tokyo. The air is heavy, still and unnervingly calm. The clock inside the command bunker reads 22:45, when a faint, unfamiliar hum begins to roll across the dark horizon. At first it sounds distant, like the low growl of thunder. But within minutes the sky trembles. Japanese radar operators squint at flickering green screens. The signal blips look strange, high, fast, steady. Nothing like the bombers they've tracked before. Altitude 10,000 meters, one whispers in disbelief. Fighters are scrambled. Pilots rush across wet tarmac, their engines screaming into the night. Above the clouds they see it, a formation of massive silver wings glinting in moonlight, engines glowing red-hot, flying higher than any Zero can reach. Machine guns open fire, tracers vanish into the cold black void. The bomb bay doors below those shining giants begin to open. Moments later, the first explosions ripple through Tokyo's industrial district, a blinding wave of fire lighting the city's veins. From the ground, civilians stare upward, unable to see the bombers, only the falling fire. For the first time, Japan realizes something new has entered its skies, something it cannot stop. The war before the giants. In early 1943, the world was split between exhaustion and escalation. Across the Pacific, the once unstoppable tide of Japanese expansion had begun to ebb. The empire that had swept across Asia, from the jungles of Malaya to the islands of the Central Pacific, was now bleeding strength. Yet in Tokyo, pride still cloaked reality. Japan's military command believed the home islands were safe, protected by thousands of kilometers of ocean and the reach of the Imperial Navy. American carriers could be fought, fleets could be sunk, but the heart of Japan, they thought, would never feel the touch of enemy bombers. That assumption was about to be shattered. The American problem. For the United States, the Pacific War presented a logistical nightmare. The enemy was dispersed across countless islands, each heavily fortified and defended by fanatical troops. The distance from American bases to Japan was staggering, more than 1,500 miles even from the nearest Pacific islands. No bomber of that time could fly to Japan, attack, and return safely. The U.S. Army Air Forces faced an unsolved problem: how to strike Japan directly. The industrial heart of the empire, Tokyo, Nagoya, Kobe, Osaka, lay untouched behind a curtain of distance. To win, America needed a machine that could cross oceans, climb above enemy fire, carry tons of bombs, and come home again. That challenge would lead to one of the most ambitious aircraft projects in history, the Boeing B29 Superfortress. Japan's air doctrine. While American engineers were sketching wings on drafting tables, Japan's air forces were still fighting the war of 1941. Their doctrine was tactical, not strategic, built for dogfights and short-range bombing runs. The Mitsubishi A6M-0, agile and deadly in the early years of the war, symbolized Japan's aerial philosophy: speed, maneuverability, and sacrifice over armor or range. Japanese planners never imagined needing long-range bombers. Their empire had expanded outward. Wars would be fought on the periphery, not the homeland. So while the Allies built heavier and faster aircraft, Japan's research lagged behind, focused on fighters for defense and medium bombers for the battlefield. But when the tide turned at Midway in June 1942, that logic began to crumble. The turning tide. The Battle of Midway shattered the Imperial Navy's striking power. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, went to the bottom of the Pacific, along with hundreds of trained pilots. For Japan, it was a loss that could never be replaced. From that moment, the empire moved from offense to defense. In 1943, the Americans began their island-hopping campaign. One by one, key Japanese positions, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, the Marshalls, fell to relentless U.S. advances. With each island captured, the distance to Japan shrank. Japan's military command watched anxiously, but believed the homeland remained out of reach. No one in Tokyo yet understood that in factories thousands of miles away, an American aircraft was being assembled that would render the Pacific Ocean irrelevant. The birth of the B-29 project in Seattle, Wichita, and Marietta, the Boeing company, was building something unprecedented. The B-29 wasn't just a bomber. It was a technological revolution. It could fly over 31,000 feet, far above the effective range of Japanese anti-aircraft guns. Its pressurized cabin allowed crews to operate comfortably at that altitude, while its remote-controlled gun turrets provided defense from all directions. It carried a bomb load of up to 20,000 pounds, and its range of 3,150 miles meant it could reach the Japanese mainland from distant Pacific bases. It was the most expensive weapons project of the war, even costlier than the Manhattan Project in its early years. Nearly $3 billion was spent designing, testing, and manufacturing the Superfortress. Factories worked around the clock. Engineers solved one mechanical failure after another: overheating engines, pressurization leaks, electronic malfunctions. Each test flight pushed the limits of what aviation had ever achieved. By late 1943, the first squadrons of B-29s were ready. But there was one problem left. There were no bases close enough to Japan. Operation Matterhorn. The solution lay in China. The U.S. planned to base the new bombers in Chengdu, a region within range of the Japanese home islands. This was Operation Matterhorn, the first stage of America's direct bombing campaign against Japan. It was an enormous logistical effort. Every gallon of fuel, every bomb, every spare part had to be flown over the hump, the treacherous Himalayan air route between India and China. Thousands of supply missions were launched just to sustain a handful of bombing sorties. The first B-29 raid took place on June 15, 1944, when 68 bombers struck the steelworks at Yawata on Kyushu. Though the damage was minimal, the psychological effect was immense. For the first time, Japanese civilians heard American bombers over their homeland. It was a sound that none could mistake: deep, powerful, and endless. The Japanese pilots who took off that night in pursuit never even reached the enemy. The bombers had flown too high, too fast. Their machine guns could not reach them, and the Zero's engines struggled to climb into the thin air. Japan's realization: in Tokyo, reports of the Yawata raid caused confusion. Some officers dismissed it as a fluke, a propaganda move by the Americans. Others understood what it truly meant. The war had entered a new phase. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Force began studying the new threat. Recovered fragments of B-29 wreckage revealed a level of engineering far beyond Japan's capacity to match. The aircraft's Wright R-3350 engines, its aluminum alloy frame, its precision electronics, all represented a different world of technology. Pilots were ordered to train for high-altitude interception, but their aircraft simply weren't capable. Even the latest models like the Nakajima Ki-44 Tojo and Kawasaki Ki-61 Haiyan could barely touch 35,000 feet. The B-29 cruised above that, invisible, untouchable. The battle for the Marianas in mid-1944, American strategy shifted again. Rather than depend on the impossible supply lines to China, the U.S. Navy launched the Mariana Islands campaign, targeting Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These islands were within 2,500 miles of Japan, the perfect launching point for sustained bombing operations. The battles were brutal. On Saipan, Japanese defenders fought to the last man. More than 29,000 Japanese troops died. But when the islands fell, the Pacific War changed overnight. The B-29s no longer needed China. They had permanent, fully supplied bases carved into the coral of the Marianas, massive airfields built with American speed and precision. From those runways, the superfortresses would soon fly in waves, hundreds at a time, over the Japanese homeland. For Japan's pilots, it meant a nightmare. A new type of war by. The end of 1944, the Imperial Japanese Air Force was facing an enemy it couldn't even see clearly. Radar picked up signals at night, warning of bombers approaching from unimaginable altitudes. The old air defense tactics, interception at low or medium height, no longer applied. Every pilot who climbed to intercept a B-29 described the same feeling: frustration and awe. The silver machine seemed to hang beyond reach. engines roaring with steady power as smaller Japanese fighters floundered below. The B-29 wasn't invincible. Mechanical failures and weather still claimed many, but in combat, its technological superiority was absolute. And yet, for all its power, America's new weapon was still finding its purpose. Precision bombing at high altitude proved difficult. Jet streams and cloud cover scattered bombs widely. U.S. commanders soon realized they needed a new strategy, one that would turn technology into terror. That realization would define the next phase of the air war and bring Japan face to face with destruction on a scale the world had never seen. Engines over the Pacific. The roar of engines became the sound of inevitability. By late 1944, the Pacific Ocean was no longer a barrier. It was a highway of war machines. From the newly captured islands of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, runways stretched like metallic scars across coral and volcanic rock. These were no ordinary airfields. Each was built to handle aircraft heavier, faster, and larger than any the world had ever seen. Thousands of American engineers, Seabees, and soldiers carved airbases out of the earth with astonishing speed. On Tinian alone, 4 parallel runways, each over 8,000 feet long, were completed in just a few months. Each could host a full squadron of B-29 Superfortresses, sleek, silver giants waiting under the tropical sun. Japan's military observers, receiving reports from island garrisons before their annihilation, understood what these airfields meant, but there was nothing they could do. The Imperial Navy no longer controlled the seas, and their submarines, once the pride of the fleet, were hunted mercilessly by Allied destroyers. The Empire was trapped, watching from afar as its fate was being constructed runway by runway. The scale of American industry, the arrival of the B-29s in the Marianas, represented not just military power, but industrial supremacy. In 1944, America was producing over 96,000 aircraft per year. Boeing's factories in Kansas and Washington ran day and night, each bomber assembled from over 100,000 precision parts. Entire rail lines were dedicated to transporting components. Crews trained in New Mexico, Utah, and Kansas before crossing the Pacific. Every element of this machine of war was organized. Fuel depots, radar installations, air-sea rescue units, weather stations, all synchronized for one purpose: to burn Japan's war machine to ash. In contrast, Japan's aircraft production was collapsing. Aluminum shortages forced engineers to build planes with wooden frames. The once feared Zero fighter now faced aircraft twice its weight, faster and deadlier. Worse, Japan lacked the fuel to train new pilots. The elite veterans of the early war were gone, replaced by boys barely out of school, sent to intercept the coming giants with minimal flight hours and no hope of survival. It was not an equal fight. The first raids from the Marianas on November 24, 1944. The first B-29s lifted off from Saipan, their target Tokyo. The mission, led by Brigadier General Emmett Rosie O'Donnell, marked the beginning of a relentless aerial campaign that would continue until Japan's surrender. The weather was poor, and navigation over 1,500 miles of open ocean was treacherous. Yet by dawn, the silver formations appeared over the Japanese capital. Sirens wailed across the city. Civilians fled into tunnels and basements. To the Japanese pilots scrambling from nearby airfields, the bombers looked like creatures from another world. Their wings shone above 30,000 feet out of reach. Anti-aircraft shells burst far below, black flowers against a distant blue sky. Few B-29s were shot down that day, but few bombs hit their intended targets. The jet streams and fast-moving rivers of air unknown to most pilots at the time scattered bombs miles off course. For Tokyo's defenders, this first raid was more alarming for what it implied than what it achieved. If the Americans could come once, they could come again. Learning from failure in Washington and Guam, American commanders studied the results with frustration. The B-29 had proven capable, but high-altitude precision bombing wasn't working. Cloud cover, winds, and the inexperience of crews turned every raid into a costly gamble. Then came Major General Curtis E. LeMay, a man of blunt discipline and ruthless logic. When he took command of 21 Bomber Command in January 1945, he changed everything. LeMay understood that Japan's wooden cities were vulnerable to fire, not to precision. He lowered the bombers' altitude to just 5,000, 9,000 feet, stripped them of defensive guns to carry more incendiaries, and ordered nighttime mass attacks. But that transformation was still weeks away. In late 1944, Japanese pilots were still climbing hopelessly toward bombers they could not reach, expending their last drops of fuel in desperate interceptions. The Japanese Defense Network, Japan's homeland defense system, had been designed for a different era. Radar stations dotted the coast, but they were primitive, often unable to distinguish between real and false echoes. Communications were fragmented, and coordination between the Army and Navy air units was plagued by rivalry. When the first large B-29 formations appeared, confusion reigned. Interceptors launched too late or too early. Anti-aircraft batteries fired blindly into the sky, wasting precious ammunition. To many young pilots, the mission became suicidal. They climbed into thin air, oxygen masks icing over, engines sputtering. At those altitudes, their machine guns jammed, wings shuddered, and the B-29s above looked untouchable, silver dots against the sun. Some pilots resorted to desperate ramming attacks, slamming their planes into bombers in acts of hopeless defiance. One Japanese ace, Masawi Tagaki, later recalled, "You fired and fired, but the tracers never reached. It was like shooting at a ghost." The shock of the Superfortress. By January 1945, Japanese intelligence had compiled detailed reports on the B-29. Engineers marveled at its power. Its engines alone produced over 700 horsepower combined. Its pressurized cabins allowed crews to fly above weather and anti-aircraft fire. Remote turrets controlled by analog computers gave it deadly accuracy. To many in Japan's aviation industry, it was a glimpse of a world they could no longer build. Aluminum was scarce, fuel nearly gone, and their best engineers conscripted into emergency weapons programs. The empire that had once prided itself on innovation now faced an enemy whose technology felt like something from the future. Civilians began to speak of the silver death that came from the sky. A whisper carried from city to city as raids grew more frequent. The rhythm of destruction from January to March 1945. The B-29s came again and again. Each mission involved hundreds of aircraft. The targets shifted: industrial centers, aircraft plants, dockyards, power stations. Even when bombs missed, the psychological effect deepened. Tokyo's night sky turned crimson, dotted with parachuting flares that illuminated entire neighborhoods before the bombing began. Japan's government ordered the construction of shelters and the dispersal of industries into rural areas. But the effort was chaotic and too late. Factories could not be moved faster than the bombers arrived. For Japanese pilots, the war had become personal torment. They were defending their own homes, their own families, yet every climb ended in futility. The sky itself seemed occupied by the enemy. The American Air Armada. By March 1945, the U.S. Army Air Forces had assembled an aerial armada beyond anything Japan could imagine. Over 1,000 operational B-29s were now stationed across the Marianas. Each could fly with 10 men aboard and deliver 7 tons of bombs. In total, they represented more firepower than all of Japan's remaining air wings combined. Supporting them were long-range P-51 Mustang fighters, based from Iwo Jima after its capture in February 1945. These escorts finally gave the bombers protection all the way to Tokyo. The circle was closing. With bases secured, fuel abundant, and logistics perfected, LeMay prepared to unleash a new kind of warfare, one that would erase entire cities in hours. Japan's desperation inside Japan, the mood was shifting from disbelief to dread. Government propaganda still promised victory through one decisive battle, but even high command officers knew the truth. Fuel stocks were nearly exhausted. Pilots trained in gliders because there was no gasoline for real aircraft. In coastal cities, anti-aircraft units rationed shells, firing only when bombers were directly overhead. Yet the Emperor's orders remained absolute. Japan would fight to the end. Defense plans called for every man, woman, and child to resist an American invasion. But even as they dug trenches, the real battle was being lost above them, in the sky. The population began to feel what no other modern nation had experienced: total aerial vulnerability, the calm before the inferno. By early March 1945, B-29 crews were weary but confident. They knew their aircraft now worked flawlessly. Their bases were secure and the enemy's defenses were breaking. LeMay's new orders arrived on March 7th. The target, Tokyo. The method, low-altitude night raid. The weapon, incendiary bombs. The bombers would fly without defensive guns to save weight and carry more fire. Each aircraft would drop hundreds of M69 incendiary clusters, designed to burst open and spray burning jellied gasoline across wide areas. This was not about hitting a factory. It was about creating a firestorm. The moment before the fire at sunset on March 9, 1945, air crews prepared on Tinian's runways. Mechanics tightened bolts, checked fuel lines, and wiped sweat from their faces. The mission brief was simple: burn Tokyo to the ground. Pilots climbed into cockpits. Engines roared in unison. 300 aircraft lifting off into the dusk, heading north. The sound filled the island, a metallic heartbeat of war. In Japan, radar operators again picked up blips approaching from the south. They warned command posts, who ordered interceptors to scramble. But the planes came in lower than ever before, beneath radar coverage. And by the time Japanese pilots reached altitude, the first waves of incendiaries were already falling. The night sky above Tokyo began to glow. Within minutes, the city would become an inferno. The B-29s had completed their evolution, from a distant technical marvel to an instrument of absolute destruction. And as the flames rose, Japanese pilots watching from the air realized the unthinkable truth: the Empire's skies no longer belonged to Japan. An airborne revolution. Every war has its moment of technological awakening, a point when one side realizes the other has built something beyond imagination. For Japan, that moment came with the B29 Superfortress. When fragments of downed bombers were recovered in 1944, Japanese engineers were astonished. The materials, precision of rivets, and complexity of systems were decades ahead of their own production standards. The aircraft was not merely an improved bomber. It was the most advanced flying machine on Earth. The B-29's wing stretched 141 feet. Its four Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines capable of generating nearly 2,200 horsepower each. Its pressurized fuselage, the first of its kind in a bomber, allowed crews to operate comfortably above 30,000 feet, where the thin air froze unprotected men within minutes. Inside, it was a world apart from any aircraft Japan had built. Remote-controlled gun turrets, guided by analog computers using a system called the Central Fire Control, allowed gunners to aim with deadly accuracy from inside the sealed cabin. Cameras, radar navigation, and advanced bomb sights turned the bomber into a moving fortress. The name was no exaggeration. Each B-29 carried tons of fuel, electronics, and armament, all orchestrated with precision. To Japan's wartime scientists, the machine represented industrial scale as weaponry, something their nation, already strangled by blockades, could not hope to replicate. The difference wasn't just in design. It was in philosophy. American engineers had built a bomber that embodied logistics dominance, a machine sustained by endless resources and global coordination. Japan's aviation, by contrast, had evolved under scarcity, craftsmanship over mass production, heroism over endurance. In the skies above Tokyo, those philosophies collided. For Japanese pilots, it was a humbling spectacle. The B-29s climbed where air thinned and engines strained. Japanese fighters, often short on fuel, could barely reach them. When they did, the bombers' remote guns met them with deadly bursts. Few attackers ever returned. In military archives, one Japanese officer summarized the imbalance bluntly: "We were men fighting gods of the air." The human angle, the sky of fear and futility. For the Americans who flew the B-29, the mission was an ordeal of endurance. Each flight to Japan could last 12 to 14 hours across endless ocean. Crews faced freezing temperatures, engine fires, and the constant threat of mechanical failure. Inside the pressurized cabin, oxygen hissed softly through masks. Outside, the Pacific rolled far below, indifferent. The bomber was a marvel, but it was also unforgiving.
Its engines, powerful but temperamental, overheated easily.
Crews learned to listen for small changes in sound, to smell for traces of burning oil. One mistake could mean a forced landing in enemy territory or a crash into the sea. Men lived in the thin space between fear and focus. They ate from ration tins, wrote letters during refueling stops, and watched the sky for fighters they rarely saw. Most missions ended with exhaustion, sweat frozen to their flight suits. Yet for all their danger, the Americans always had a sense of inevitability, a belief that technology and numbers would see them through. For Japanese pilots, the human experience was the opposite, a descent into despair. They launched knowing their aircraft were slower, weaker, and ill-equipped. In many cases, their mission briefings included no plan for survival. A pilot of the 47th Sentai later recalled, "When the alert came, we took off knowing we could not climb high enough. We fired from below, our guns reaching for shapes in the stars. Then we fell away, our fuel gone. Every man knew the truth, and we were not defending our nation, we were dying in the sky." These pilots watched their cities burn from above. Some were forced to circle over the inferno, unable to land because runways were destroyed. Others landed at remote strips, their aircraft shot full of holes, only to find no replacements or spare parts. As B-29 raids intensified, Japanese aircrew morale collapsed. Reports describe pilots weeping in silence or staring at the sky long after missions ended. The code of Bushido, the samurai's ideal of dying honorably, had been replaced by a new kind of war where bravery could not bridge the gap of altitude and technology. On the ground, civilians learned to live under constant threat. School children carried small shovels to dig fire breaks. Families built shelters that could not withstand incendiaries. Tokyo, once proud and bright, became a city of ashes waiting for its next night of fire. The human toll, invisible to those flying above, was immense. 3. The tactical angle, from precision to annihilation. When the B-29s first entered service, U.S. commanders believed in precision bombing, the idea that war industries could be crippled with surgical strikes. The plan was rooted in interwar doctrine, shaped by theorists like Billy Mitchell and the U.S. Army Air Corps Tactical School. But Japan's geography made that idea impossible. The island's weather patterns, dominated by high-altitude jet streams, scattered bombs unpredictably. Cloud cover, constant over much of Japan, obscured targets. The early raids achieved little. In the Marianas, intelligence officers pored over aerial photographs, showing bombs landing miles from intended sites. Meanwhile, losses from mechanical failure mounted. The promise of precision turned to frustration. Then General Curtis LeMay arrived. His philosophy was brutally simple. If precision failed, destroy everything. He abandoned altitude, ordering the B-29s to fly lower and faster. He stripped most of their defensive guns, trusting that speed and darkness would protect them. The bomb load was switched from high explosives to incendiaries, napalm-filled canisters, designed to ignite Japan's tightly packed wooden cities. The result was a strategy that merged efficiency with horror. On the night of March 9–10, 1945, 334 B-29s launched the first full-scale incendiary raid on Tokyo. Flying at altitudes of just 5,000 to 7,000 feet, they dropped nearly 700 tons of fire. The result was a firestorm so intense that it created its own wind system, sucking oxygen from the streets and incinerating tens of thousands of civilians. U.S. crews reported seeing the glow from 150 miles away. Japan's air defenses, confused by the low approach, barely responded. Radar operators thought the blips were smaller aircraft or decoys. By the time they understood, Tokyo was already a furnace. In the aftermath, American analysts noted the shift. One mission had done more damage than all previous precision raids combined. LeMay's new doctrine was vindicated. To the Japanese defenders, it felt like the end of the world. The superfortresses no longer came for factories, they came for the cities themselves. The line between victory and atrocity. By spring 1945, Japan's cities were burning nightly. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama, all reduced to ashes. Yet in Washington and on the Marianas airfields, the question lingered. Had the line been crossed? For the men who planned the raids, the answer was both simple and unbearable. Their goal was to end the war quickly, to save lives in the long term by breaking Japan's will to fight. But every night's success was measured in square miles of destruction and estimates of civilian dead. The B-29, a symbol of engineering triumph, had become an instrument of moral ambiguity. LeMay, blunt and unflinching, famously said, If we lose, we'll be tried as war criminals. He knew what his decisions meant, but he also knew that Japan's military government had shown no signs of surrender. Even as defeat became inevitable, historians still debate whether the incendiary campaign was necessary, or whether it represented a descent into vengeance masked as strategy. Inside the aircraft, however, the moral question was more immediate. Many crewmen later recalled the sight of cities burning far below, the fires spreading like veins of molten gold. One B-29 navigator, Richard M. Jacobs, wrote in his journal, "It looked like the Earth itself was alive, and we were the heartbeat." Another crewman said the smell of burning wood and flesh reached 10,000 feet. They knew what they were doing, but in war, the mind builds walls to survive. In Tokyo, moral reasoning took a different form. Civilians spoke of shikata nai, it cannot be helped. The phrase was less resignation than armor, a way to endure the unimaginable. Japan's leaders, meanwhile, still refused to surrender. The government maintained propaganda broadcasts claiming victory was near. For many citizens, death became preferable to defeat. The fire raids didn't just destroy homes, they incinerated belief sound. The psychological angle, terror from the sky, the B-29 created a new psychology of fear. Unlike previous raids, which came sporadically and at low altitude, the Superfortress arrived invisible and inevitable. From the ground, they were rarely seen, only heard. A deep metallic rumble that rolled through the night like approaching thunder. Children learned to recognize it instantly. Some would count the seconds between the sound and the first explosions as if it were a storm. For Japanese civilians, the raids blurred the boundary between life and nightmare. Entire families fled to rivers only to suffocate from lack of oxygen as the firestorms consumed the air. Others hid in underground shelters, listening to the roar above, clutching their children, waiting for silence that might never come. The American crews, too, bore psychological scars. They flew missions that no longer resembled combat. It was extermination from altitude. Gunners rarely fired their weapons. There was no enemy, no dogfights, no heroism, only the mechanical repetition of destruction. One pilot later said, "It felt like we weren't fighting men anymore, just gravity." Psychologists who interviewed veterans years later found a recurring dream, flying over a city of fire, unable to turn back, unable to stop. Meanwhile, Japan's defense forces entered a phase of collective despair. Fighter pilots volunteered for ramming missions, Tai-Atari attacks, throwing their aircraft into the bomber's wings. It was suicide, but to them it was purpose. On the ground, fire brigades formed human chains to pass buckets of water, long after the heat made survival impossible. Tokyo's population began to speak of the Yami no Toki, the time of darkness. Every siren was a prophecy. Every sunrise a miracle. 3. The leadership angle. LeMay and the generals. General Curtis LeMay was 38 years old when he took command of the Dandiwaman Bomber Command in the Pacific. Stocky, pipe-smoking, and direct to the point of cruelty, he cared little for public opinion. He believed war was won not by emotion but by mathematics, by calculating how much destruction was needed to break an enemy's will. He changed everything: flight altitudes, formations, target priorities. His orders often came with no debate. If it works, he told his men, we'll keep doing it. If it doesn't, we'll change it. His subordinates both feared and respected him. They called him Iron Ass, a nickname he wore with pride. When questioned about civilian casualties, LeMay replied, "You kill enough of them and they stop fighting." To modern ears, it's barbaric. But in 1945, with invasion plans for Japan projecting 1 million Allied deaths, his logic held grim appeal. Across the Pacific, Japan's military command faced its own leadership crisis. Generals like Anami Korichika and Umezu Yoshijiro clung to the notion of honorable resistance. Even as cities burned, they argued that surrender would dishonor the emperor. It was a decision rooted in the samurai tradition, to die rather than yield. But Emperor Hirohito, increasingly isolated, saw what they could not. After the March firebombing of Tokyo, he reportedly visited the ruins in secret. Witnesses later claimed he stood silently for several minutes looking at the ashes. From that day onward, he began to consider the unthinkable: peace. The B-29s had not just broken Japan's cities. They had fractured the unity of its leadership. The turning point. Fire and silence. By mid-1945, Japan was a nation of ruins. The superfortress fleets now operated with near-total impunity. Airfields, railways, and harbors vanished in smoke. Yet still no surrender came. Then came the next evolution. Project Silverplate, the atomic bomb program. The same aircraft that had burned Tokyo would soon carry a new weapon from the Pacific island of Tinian. When Enola Gay lifted off on August 6, 1945, it was not just another bombing mission. It was the culmination of every technological, moral, and psychological force that had converged in the skies above Japan. At 8:15 a.m., Hiroshima became the final extension of LeMay's doctrine, victory through total destruction. For Japan, it was the moment when fire turned into silence. Reflection. The echo of the superfortress. After the war, as the ruins cooled and Japan began to rebuild, a strange paradox emerged. The B-29, once a symbol of terror, became a blueprint for the modern world. Pressurization, radar navigation, and long-range logistics all became peacetime innovations. In Japan, the survivors built a nation devoted to technology, efficiency, and precision, perhaps subconsciously mirroring the very machine that had destroyed them. From the ashes of the superfortress came the jet age, the space race, and the post-war peace that both nations now shared. But beneath that progress lies a memory, the low, steady hum of engines over a sleeping city. And in every modern bomber that crosses a night sky, there's still a whisper of those who once looked up from the flames, and those who looked down through the smoke. The B-29 was not just a weapon, it was a mirror. It showed humanity its greatest ingenuity and its deepest capacity for destruction. And for one brief moment in 1945, it ruled the skies like a god, until the world learned to fear what gods can do. March 9, 1945. The night the wind turned to fire. Tokyo had already been bombed before. But nothing could prepare the city for the night of March 9-10, 1945, the most destructive air raid in human history. At 22:30, 334 B-29 superfortresses took off from the island of Guam, Tinian, and Saipan. Their payload, nearly 1,700 tons of incendiary bombs, each designed not to explode, but to ignite. Each bomb cluster contained hundreds of smaller canisters filled with jellied gasoline and magnesium. When released from 5,000 feet, they scattered across Tokyo like sparks from a torch. The mission's architect, Major General Curtis LeMay, had abandoned high-altitude precision bombing. He ordered his crews to fly low and around 1,500 to 2,000 meters and to strike at night. The strategy was brutally simple: overwhelm Japan's fire defense capacity by turning its wooden cities into infernos. The first wave reached the capital just before midnight. B-29s approached from multiple directions, their bomb bays opening in sequence. What followed was a sight that no one on Earth had seen before. Within minutes, the eastern wards of Shitamachi, a district of small workshops, paper homes and narrow lanes, and were engulfed in flame. The napalm bombs ignited instantly, creating vortexes of heat that rose thousands of feet into the air. The wind carried the flames across the Sumida River, and in less than 2 hours, a firestorm formed, temperatures exceeding 1,600 degrees Celsius. Entire neighborhoods vaporized. Firefighters tried to pump water from canals, only to find the rivers boiling. Families fled toward the riverbanks for safety, clutching children, pets, and photographs. Many suffocated, not from smoke but from lack of oxygen. The fire consumed the air itself. Pilots flying overhead felt turbulence from the rising heat. One recalled seeing the glow of Tokyo from 150 miles away. Another wrote, "The city looked like a living thing breathing fire." By dawn, 16 square miles of Tokyo lay in ruins. More than 100,000 civilians were dead, most burned alive. 1 million more were homeless. It was the deadliest air raid of World War II, surpassing even Dresden or Hamburg. For LeMay, the results confirmed his grim calculus. The raid had achieved what months of high-altitude precision bombing could not: total paralysis of an enemy city. But for Japan, it marked the beginning of the end. a realization that even survival was now uncertain. The days after, ashes and silence. When the fires subsided, the city's center was gone. Survivors walked through smoke-filled streets where the air shimmered with heat. Bodies lined the canals, so many that rescue crews could not count them. In Imperial Palace reports, Japanese officials described an ocean of death. Yet the government released only minimal public statements, insisting that morale remained high. But morale was collapsing. The raids continued: Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama. Each city followed the same pattern: night approach, low-level attack, complete annihilation. The B-29 Bomber Command grew into a relentless machine. Crews flew up to 3 missions a week, sleeping in shifts, maintaining their aircraft in punishing tropical conditions. Inside each B-29, 10 men shared a single goal: return alive. Enemy resistance was still fierce: flak batteries, night fighters, and the ever-present risk of mechanical failure. The Superfortress was advanced but fragile. Overheating engines and malfunctioning pressurization systems claimed as many lives as combat. Still, they flew. Every mission meant more burned cities, more strategic paralysis. In one of his wartime reports, LeMay wrote coldly, "We are wiping out manufacturing and morale. The sooner we finish, the fewer will die." His logic, though brutal, matched the Allied objective: avoid a bloody invasion of Japan's home islands. 3. The Japanese response: the desperate counterstrike. In Tokyo's military command centers, disbelief turned to desperation. Japan's air defenses, once considered elite, were powerless. The Nakajima Ki-44 Tojo and Ki-84 Frank fighters could barely reach the B-29's altitude, and even when they did, they faced heavily armed bombers with computerized gun turrets. Pilots resorted to ramming attacks, known as tayatari, slamming their aircraft into the bomber's wings or tails in suicide attempts. Some succeeded, but the losses were devastating. Radar stations struggled to track the night raids. Communication networks were in ruins. Tokyo's anti-aircraft guns fired blindly into the darkness. The Japanese government began to prepare civilians for what they called the decisive Battle of the Homeland. Young boys were trained with bamboo spears. Women were taught to throw Molotov cocktails. But even among Japan's generals, the hopelessness was spreading. One air defense commander wrote in his diary, "We can no longer fight the sky." By June 1945, B-29 raids had destroyed 40% of Japan's urban area. And yet, no surrender came. Harrier, the turning point, Saipan, Guam, and the shadow of Tinian, thousands of miles away. On the island of Tinian, a new kind of B-29 mission was taking shape. In a fenced compound known only to select personnel, engineers and scientists worked under the Manhattan Project's Pacific Division. Their objective? Modify the B-29 to carry a single bomb unlike any other. These aircraft were part of Project Silverplate, hand-built versions of the Superfortress with enlarged bomb bays, stripped armor, and modified engines. They were faster, lighter, and designed for one purpose: to deliver the atomic bomb. The crews assigned to them trained in secret. Their commanding officer, Colonel Paul Tibbets, chose one of the Silverplates and named it after his mother, Enola Gay. While LeMay's bombers continued to torch Japanese cities, another kind of destruction was being prepared, one that would make even Tokyo's inferno look small. And as Japan's leaders clung to hope that America would soon seek peace, the United States was readying a weapon that would end the war in a single flash. The Superfortress had evolved from a machine of fire to a carrier of the sun itself. And when that sun rose over Hiroshima, the world would never be the same again. August 6, 1945. Enola Gay. The morning was clear over Hiroshima. At 7:09 a.m., air raid sirens wailed briefly, then fell silent. The radar operators had spotted only a few incoming aircraft, nothing resembling a large-scale attack. Moments later, a single B-29 crossed the coastline. It was the Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, flying at 31,000 feet. The aircraft had taken off hours earlier from Tinian Island, carrying a bomb known only by its codename, Little Boy. Inside the cabin, the crew was tense but focused. They had trained for weeks knowing little of what the bomb actually was. The only certainty was its weight, over 9,000 pounds, and its unprecedented secrecy. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb bay doors opened. A blinding flash followed, brighter than the sun, hotter than any fire humanity had ever created. A white-blue sphere expanded in silence, swallowing the city below. Then came the shockwave. In less than 1 second, Hiroshima ceased to exist. Temperatures reached 4,000 degrees at ground zero. People standing near the hypocenter simply vanished, their shadows seared into walls. Wooden homes ignited instantly. Steel bridges twisted like wire. The mushroom cloud rose over 60,000 feet high, visible for hundreds of miles. Tibbets and his crew turned away, stunned into silence. None of them spoke for several minutes. The bombardier, Thomas Farabee, later said, "It was like watching the world end, quietly." The message to Japan. Surrender or extinction. The next morning, Tokyo received fragmentary reports. No one understood what had happened. The communications minister described a new type of bomb that had destroyed the city in one strike. Scientists debated whether it was chemical, or perhaps radioactive, a term few understood. In Washington, President Harry S. Truman released a statement. The Japanese began the war from the air at Pearl Harbor. They have been repaid manyfold. His tone was deliberate, firm, final, and unmistakable. The United States now held the power to end the war on its own terms. But even then, Japan did not surrender. The military faction within the government refused to accept the ultimatum. They believed the Americans possessed only 1 or 2 such bombs, not enough to compel total submission. They were wrong. 3. August 9, 1945. Boxcar and Nagasaki. At 3:47 a.m., another silver-plate B-29 lifted off from Tinian. Its name, Boxcar, commanded by Major Charles Sweeney. Its payload, a plutonium bomb called Fat Man. The primary target was Kokura, a major arsenal city. But heavy clouds obscured the sight. After 3 failed passes, Sweeney turned toward the secondary target. Nagasaki fuel was running dangerously low. At 11:02 a.m., Boxcar released the bomb through a gap in the clouds. The explosion was different, more irregular, but even more powerful. A column of flame rose over the Urakami Valley, obliterating factories, hospitals, and churches. The blast killed 40,000 instantly. Tens of thousands more died in the days that followed. From the cockpit, Sweeney later said, "The whole city was hidden in smoke. It was as if we had dropped the bomb into hell." Within hours, Radio Tokyo confirmed the unimaginable. 2 cities gone. 2 weapons beyond comprehension. 4. The emperor decides in the imperial palace. Emperor Hirohito called an emergency meeting. The Gozen Kaigi, the Supreme War Council. The generals argued fiercely. Some demanded resistance to the end. Others urged surrender before the entire nation was erased. For hours, they debated as air raid sirens continued to echo over Tokyo. Then, breaking centuries of imperial silence, Hirohito spoke. He said, "The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. It was a coded admission of defeat, but a historic one. For the first time, the emperor himself intervened in government policy. He decided to accept the Potsdam Declaration ending the war. Yet even that decision sparked chaos. On the night of August 14th, radical officers attempted a coup, storming the palace in an effort to prevent surrender. They searched for the emperor's recorded speech to destroy it. They failed. At noon on August 15, 1945, Japan heard his voice for the first time in history. The broadcast, known as the Gyokuen Hoso, played across a nation in ruins. In calm, archaic Japanese, Hirohito said, "Endure the unendurable. Bear the unbearable." Tears and disbelief filled the streets. The war, the empire, was over. The Superfortress stands down. When the surrender was announced, the B-29 crews across the Pacific received new orders. Stand by. For the first time in over a year, their engines fell silent. No more target briefings. No more dawn takeoffs. The men who had flown through flak, darkness, and storms of fire finally slept. On September 2, 1945, the Japanese instrument of surrender was signed aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Overhead, a formation of B-29s flew in salute, 462 aircraft, gleaming in the morning sun. For many pilots, it was a moment of closure, a final flyover not of destruction, but of peace. Yet beneath the ceremony, they understood what had truly ended the war. It wasn't diplomacy or invasion. It was the Superfortress, the machine that could bring death from 30,000 feet, anywhere, anytime. The legacy begins. The B-29's role did not end with Japan's surrender. Its technology paved the way for the B-50, then the B-52, and eventually the jet-powered bombers that defined the Cold War. Its pressurized cabin, advanced radar, and long-range design became the foundation for modern aviation. But the moral weight it carried never lifted. Even Tibbets himself, decades later, refused to apologize. "I was doing my job," he said. LeMay would go on to lead the Strategic Air Command, shaping U.S. nuclear policy for generations. The same doctrines he developed over Tokyo, rapid destruction, overwhelming force, became the logic of deterrence in the atomic age. The B-29 had shown what total war could look like, and once the world had seen it, it could never unsee it. End. Fire into silence. By the end of 1945, Japan's cities were black scars on a once lush landscape. Out of 68 major cities, 66 had been bombed, nearly 2 million buildings destroyed, over 330,000 civilians dead. The ruins of Tokyo glowed faintly at night, not from fire anymore, but from memory. From the skies above, the Superfortress had rewritten warfare itself. No battlefront, no trenches, no armies clashing in the mud, only the hum of engines, the opening of bomb bay doors, and the quiet descent of fire. For Japan, the war ended not in surrender, but in silence, a silence broken only by the distant echo of those engines that once ruled the sky. The firestorms had ended. But a new kind of storm, one made of light and radiation, had just begun, when fire became the weapon. March 9th, 1945. Midnight approaches. The wind over Tokyo blows at 20 miles per hour from the southwest, perfect for what the Americans call Operation Meeting House. In the Mariana Islands, on the tarmac at Saipan and Tinian, 334 B-29 Superfortresses line up under floodlights. Ground crews move like clockwork, loading not high-explosive bombs but clusters of M69 incendiaries, canisters filled with jellied gasoline and magnesium that will ignite on impact. These are not designed to shatter concrete. They are meant to burn people, homes, entire neighborhoods. Each B-29 carries 7 tons of them. In total, nearly 1,700 tons of fire are about to fall on Tokyo. At 5:35 p.m., Washington time, the first group takes off. Inside each plane, the crew is silent. Many have been briefed on the nature of tonight's target, a densely packed area of wooden houses known as the Low City. It is where Tokyo's working class lives. The heart of its small factories and supply lines at 12:08 a.m. Tokyo time. Radar operators at the city's air defense posts report incoming aircraft. Sirens begin to wail, but this time the Japanese defenders do not know what kind of attack is coming. Searchlights swing skyward. The first flares drift down, marking target zones. Then, at 12:15 a.m., the night erupts. The first incendiary clusters burst open in midair, scattering hundreds of small flaming cylinders across the city blocks. Within minutes, the wooden houses ignite like paper lanterns. The wind fans the flames into walls of fire that consume entire neighborhoods. American pilots watching from 8,000 feet can see the inferno spreading, a vast orange sea beneath them. The smoke rises so high that it buffets their aircraft. Navigator Joseph Cornelius later recalled, "We could smell burning wood even at our altitude. It was as if the whole city had become a furnace. Tokyo's fire brigades are overwhelmed almost immediately. Hoses melt, pumps fail, and water lines burst. Civilians rush toward the rivers for safety, but the bridges are choked with debris and firestorms pull oxygen from the streets. Temperatures on the ground exceed 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Entire families suffocate in underground shelters as flames consume the oxygen. People fall where they stand, overcome by the heat. The Nakajima aircraft plant, the Matsutani textile district, and dozens of small metalworks vanish by morning. When the B-29s finally turn back toward the Marianas, The glow of Tokyo's destruction follows them hundreds of miles out to sea. Behind them lies a city almost erased. By dawn, 16 square miles of Tokyo are gone. 100,000 people are dead. The single most destructive air raid in human history. Worse than Dresden, Hamburg, or even Hiroshima. More than 1 million are left homeless. The sky of steel. In the aftermath, Japan's fighter command is stunned. Intercept reports show that not a single B-29 was brought down over Tokyo that night by air combat. A few were hit by flak or engine failure, but the majority returned safely. The Japanese government begins to panic. They had expected the Americans to continue with high-altitude precision strikes. Instead, LeMay's strategy has shifted to low-altitude area firebombing, a doctrine no one in Japan had anticipated, and it works. Over the next 5 months, B-29s rained destruction on 66 Japanese cities. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama, one after another reduced to ashes. In total, nearly 500,000 civilians perish and 8 million lose their homes. Factories vanish, transport lines are cut, and production falls to less than 30% of 1944 levels. Fighter fuel shortages cripple the air defense network. Pilots are forced to train with wooden rifles and short rations. By July 1945, the B-29 is flying almost unopposed. Japanese radar still picks up the approaching formations, but there is little that can be done. Anti-aircraft shells are in short supply. Fuel is gone. Many airfields are craters. The sky belongs entirely to America now. The pilots shock. For Japanese fighter pilots, each sortie becomes an act of desperation. The Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate and the Kawasaki Ki-100 are fast and agile, but they cannot reach the B-29's cruising altitude, even when LeMay's bombers fly lower for incendiary runs. Their defensive gun turrets and tight box formations make them deadly opponents. Lieutenant Kuroiwa later said, "It was like attacking a moving fortress." Every approach meant fire from 5 or 6 guns. You could see the tracer lines crossing in the air. It felt impossible to break through. Others recalled the frustration of watching silver bombers drift serenely over their cities, too high to touch. "We felt powerless," said pilot Yoshio Fukui, "like insects trying to sting a god." The unstoppable machine. Inside Japan's War Council, the shock turns to despair. Prime Minister Suzuki privately admits that the nation can no longer defend its skies. Emperor Hirohito receives reports describing cities reduced to ashes within hours. When the B-29s reach Kure and Hiroshima in late July, nothing is left to stop them. Still, the raids continue. On August 6th, a single B-29 named Enola Gay takes off from Tinian. It carries one bomb, Little Boy, the same design, the same crew formation, the same sky, but this time, the bomb's flash replaces 1,000 incendiaries. The atomic age begins, born from the same machine that had already erased Japan's cities with fire. In Tokyo, surviving officers stare at reconnaissance photos from the final weeks of bombing. They see what remains: black scars, empty grids, and rivers choked with ash. "We had no answer," one wrote later. The B-29 was not only a bomber, it was a prophecy. The Superfortress had transformed air power itself, and, in doing so, forced a nation to the brink of surrender. By mid-August 1945, Japan stands surrounded by ruins, its skies patrolled by bombers it cannot reach. The war that began in the clouds over Pearl Harbor is ending in fire over Tokyo, and with that destruction comes the reckoning. What these raids meant, what they cost, and what the world would learn from them. Cities turned to dust. In the spring of 1945, the Japanese archipelago no longer resembled the empire it once was. From the air, American reconnaissance photographs revealed a gray wasteland, block after block of flattened timber and corrugated roofs, stretching endlessly from Tokyo to Osaka. Whole cities had vanished beneath the wings of the B-29. Out of Japan's 66 largest urban centers, 58 lay partly or wholly destroyed. Nagoya was 43% burned, Kobe 55%, Yokohama nearly 50%. In Tokyo alone, an area greater than the entire city of Washington, D.C. had been erased. At street level, survivors picked their way through twisted iron and blackened clay roof tiles. Makeshift camps sprang up along the Sumida River and in the ruins of schoolyards. The smell of charred wood mixed with the sweetness of decay. In some districts, rescue teams found whole families fused together by heat, Japanese newspapers, and still censored by the government, published vague reports of enemy air activity. But everyone knew. The night sky had become the Americans' domain, and it rained death without warning. A nation stripped of breath by May 1945, Japan's production of aircraft, fuel, and ammunition had collapsed. The once mighty Mitsubishi plant stood silent. Rail networks were mangled. Steel and aluminum shipments had fallen by more than 80%. LeMay's bombing campaign had achieved what naval blockades and submarine warfare could not. It paralyzed the empire's industrial heart. Small workshops that supplied the army with bearings, wiring, and shell casings were obliterated. Without those lifelines, the Zero fighter squadrons grounded themselves, starved of parts and petrol. Food shortages grew desperate. Farmers, deprived of fertilizer and machinery, could not meet demand. Urban families boiled weeds and bark for soup. The black market flourished, but even rice became a luxury. At night, Tokyo's once vibrant avenues lay silent. With electricity rationed and curfews enforced, the only glow came from smoldering ruins, the ghosts of neighborhoods that no longer existed. The human weight. In the chaos of survival, the human cost became clearer. The March firebombing alone left 1 million civilians homeless. Across the archipelago, 8 million people wandered displaced, hospitals overflowed. Burn victims were treated with sake and oil because medical supplies had run out. Orphanages multiplied. Trains carried refugees northward toward untouched countryside, where rural villages struggled to feed them. The Japanese government never released official casualty numbers until after the war. Later studies by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey would estimate 330,000 civilians killed in all air raids, more than the combined Allied bombing deaths in Germany and Italy. Each attack carried not only physical destruction, but psychological collapse. For the first time in modern Japanese history, ordinary citizens felt utterly defenseless. The empire's myth of invincibility, of divine protection, disintegrated amid the falling fire. Command in crisis. Inside the imperial palace, senior officers debated the unthinkable. Should they surrender? Or fight to the last? Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki and Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo argued that Japan must seek a diplomatic exit through the Soviet Union. But the Army's high command insisted that honor demanded resistance. They still believed that if Japan inflicted enough casualties on an American invasion force, Washington might negotiate favorable terms. The B-29 raids, however, made that illusion harder to sustain. By June, the Imperial General Headquarters had received intelligence that no major city remained safe. Even Kyoto and Niigata, previously spared, appeared on LeMay's target list. Emperor Hirohito, increasingly isolated, began to record his impressions privately. In one diary entry preserved by palace aides, he wrote simply, "Our people are like leaves scattered by the storm, across the Pacific." On the other side of the ocean, the United States viewed the campaign as proof of air power's supremacy. LeMay's forces had demonstrated that strategic bombing could end a war without a costly invasion. Yet among his crews, the victory felt hollow. Pilots returning from the Tokyo raid described the horror below. Gunner Raymond Kessler recalled, "We could see the fire eating the city alive. The flames rolled like waves. I never forgot that color, deep red, almost black." Mechanics at Tinian and Guam spoke quietly about fire jobs, uneasy at what those missions meant. The official communiques praised efficiency and tonnage dropped, but the men understood they were not fighting soldiers anymore. They were burning civilians. LeMay himself remained unapologetic. When questioned after the war, he said, "If we had lost, I suppose I'd have been tried as a war criminal. But we didn't lose." To Washington's planners, the devastation was a grim but necessary arithmetic. Each burned city brought Japan closer to surrender and potentially saved hundreds of thousands of American lives that an invasion might cost. The silent skies. By late July 1945, the B-29s flew with impunity. Japan's air defense network had collapsed so completely that many missions faced no interception at all. Crews often returned to base reporting they hadn't seen a single enemy plane. Reconnaissance photographs taken by the 3rd Photographic Squadron reveal the eerie stillness, vast black craters where cities once glowed. Rivers twisted through ash fields. Only the steel skeletons of bridges and factory frames remained. Among the rubble, American intelligence officers later found signs of Japan's final, futile attempts at resistance. Balloon bombs launched toward the U.S. mainland. Primitive intercept rockets, even experimental jet prototypes abandoned half-finished. None had made a difference. The Japanese pilots who survived the final months of the war remembered that silence as more terrifying than combat. When no planes came, said ace pilot Saburo Sakai, we knew we had already lost. As Japan's world turned to dust, one question lingered among its surviving leaders. What would it take to make the United States stop? The answer would arrive only weeks later, with the dawn of a weapon beyond imagination, the last days of the empire. By August 1945, Japan was a nation on its knees. The B29 Superfortress had done more than destroy factories and neighborhoods. It had burned away the illusion of endurance. Rail lines lay twisted across charred plains. The once proud merchant fleet was reduced to rusting skeletons in shallow harbors. Entire divisions of soldiers were stranded on islands, unable to return home. The few aircraft that remained were hidden in mountain tunnels or buried under camouflage netting, preserved for a battle that would never come. From the sky, the Americans saw no movement. Reconnaissance photos of the Kanto Plain showed what looked like an abandoned civilization. And yet, inside underground bunkers near Tokyo, the Imperial General Staff still debated. Some advocated a decisive battle, a final stand against the American invasion they knew was coming. Others whispered that surrender was inevitable, but dared not speak the word aloud. It was at this moment that the world's most devastating machine, the B-29, was given a new kind of mission. The weapon of silence. At 2:45 a.m. on August 6, 1945, a B-29 named Enola Gay, commanded by Colonel Paul W. Tibbets, lifted off from Northfield on Tinian Island. Its target, Hiroshima. The aircraft itself was identical to hundreds of others that had crossed Japanese skies before, but its cargo was singular, a bomb of uranium-235, codenamed Little Boy, designed to unleash the energy of the atom. Just after 8:15 a.m., Tibbets's crew watched as the bomb detached and fell toward the city's heart. 43 seconds later, Hiroshima vanished in a white flash brighter than the sun. The B-29 shuddered as the shockwave hit. Behind it, a boiling mushroom cloud climbed into the sky, a vision of destruction that defied comprehension. In an instant, 70,000 people were dead. Tens of thousands more would die in the weeks that followed. 3 days later, another B-29, Boxcar, piloted by Major Charles Sweeney, dropped a second bomb, Fat Man, on Nagasaki. The pattern was the same. One plane, one city, complete annihilation. The same aircraft that had once carried tons of incendiaries now delivered a single bomb with the power of 1,000 raids. Japan's leaders finally understood. There was nothing left to fight with and nothing left to defend. The Emperor speaks. On August 15, 1945, the voice of Emperor Hirohito echoed through a nation of ruins. Crackling through radios powered by car batteries and makeshift generators, his message was clear. The enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb. Should we continue to fight, it would lead to the ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation. The war was over. Millions wept openly, from soldiers hiding in forests to mothers standing in the ashes of their homes. Some refused to believe it. A handful of officers attempted mutiny to prevent the surrender broadcast, but they failed. At noon, when the Emperor's recorded voice played nationwide, even the air raid sirens remained silent. For the first time in years, the skies above Japan were empty. No bombers came, no guns fired, only the distant hum of wind through the wreckage, occupation, and reckoning. When American forces landed in Japan weeks later, they were stunned by what they saw. General Douglas MacArthur's staff walked through Tokyo's ruins, a metropolis turned to dust. Streets had been cleared only enough for jeeps and supply trucks. Children played beside heaps of debris that had once been homes. The official U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey began its work soon after. Its conclusion was both triumphal and haunting. Japan's defeat was the inevitable result of her inability to withstand sustained strategic air attack. The report found that nearly 25% of all urban housing had been destroyed. Industrial production had fallen by 3/4. Transport and communications networks had ceased to function. The B-29 had accomplished, in 8 months, what years of blockade and ground combat could not. But the same survey also noted a disturbing truth. The destruction of Japan's war capability had been purchased at immense human cost. Most of those killed were civilians, not soldiers. The boundary between military and civilian targets, once a principle of warfare, had dissolved under the weight of technological power, a machine that changed the world. In the years after the war, the B-29 Superfortress became both a symbol of victory and a warning. Its legacy stretched far beyond the Pacific. It was the first aircraft to make intercontinental bombing a reality, paving the way for the Cold War's strategic doctrine, where cities, not battlefields, defined deterrence. The B-29's pressurized cabin, long-range radar, and remote control guns became standard features for decades. But for those who had flown it, the memories were mixed. Many veterans spoke with pride about its engineering. A masterpiece of American industry. Others, like navigator Robert Morgan, confessed that every time they heard the sound of heavy engines, they thought of Tokyo's burning streets. In Japan, the bomber entered legend as a force of nature, Baku no Kami, the god of explosions. School children in the post-war years would point to the sky at the sound of distant aircraft and whisper, B-san. Museums today preserve fragments of downed B-29s, their twisted aluminum still bearing the scars of flak. For older survivors, the sight evokes not anger but sorrow, a reminder of the nights when the heavens themselves seemed to burn. The lesson in the ashes. When the Tokyo firebombing survivors were interviewed decades later, their testimonies revealed a deeper truth. A woman named Kyoko Murakami, who was 12 in 1945, said, "We didn't hate the planes. We feared the fire. The planes were too high, too bright, like stars. We only saw the fire they left behind." Her words capture the paradox that defined the end of World War II. Humanity's ability to create technology capable of both progress and annihilation. The B-29 was not born from cruelty. It was built from fear, the fear of losing a war that had already cost millions of lives. Yet in its power, it forced civilization to confront its own reflection. By the time Japan surrendered, the B-29 had flown more than 30,000 sorties, dropped 170,000 tons of bombs, and rewritten the nature of warfare. Its shadow would stretch into Korea, Vietnam, and beyond, wherever nations believed that victory could fall from the sky. The fires had gone out. The war was over. But from the ashes of Tokyo and Hiroshima, a new world was rising, one shaped by the same machine that had once turned night into day. And as peace returned, the question remained, what had humanity truly won? The echo in the sky. Decades have passed since that summer, when the world changed forever. The engines of the B-29 no longer thunder over the Pacific, yet their echo still lingers in the hum of jetliners, the roar of rockets, the quiet dread of nuclear deterrence. For Japan, the bombings were more than defeat. They were the shattering of an identity. A nation built on discipline and divine myth had been brought to its knees not by armies, but by technology, by machines so far beyond its reach that resistance became an act of futility. The survivors rebuilt amid silence. Tokyo's ashes became the foundation of a new city, a new nation, one that would rise from the ruins to become an industrial power once again. But deep beneath that success lay a collective memory that refused to fade. The sound of engines in the night and the red glow that once swallowed the horizon. Every generation since has asked the same question: did it have to happen this way? The calculus of fire. Historians still debate whether strategic bombing shortened the war or merely transformed its cruelty. The arithmetic of destruction is precise, but morality is not. By LeMay's logic, every bomb dropped over Tokyo was a step toward saving lives that would have been lost in an invasion. His mission was never vengeance, but efficiency, to break Japan's will as quickly as possible. Yet when one studies the maps of burned-out cities, the argument blurs. Each blackened square on those reconnaissance photographs was not just a factory. It was a neighborhood, a school, a family. The fire that consumed Tokyo did not distinguish between soldier and civilian, and therein lies the paradox of progress, that the same brilliance capable of engineering the world's most advanced bomber also engineered the means of its own horror, air power ascendant. The B-29 marked the beginning of a new epoch, one in which wars would be decided not by trenches or ships, but by dominance of the sky. Its legacy shaped the Cold War before it began. The American B-50, B-47, and B-52 all descended from its frame. Jet propulsion, nuclear delivery, aerial refueling, every innovation that followed owed its lineage to that silver fortress born in Wichita and Seattle. For the Soviet Union, the lesson was immediate. Stalin ordered his engineers to reverse engineer captured B-29s, creating the Tu-4 Bull, a near-exact copy that gave Moscow its first intercontinental bomber. Within a few years, two superpowers faced each other across oceans, each with the ability to annihilate the other's cities in hours. The world had entered the age of total reach, and the shadow of the B-29 stretched across it. The human horizon. But beyond the technology, there was something more lasting, a shift in human perception. Before 1945, war had boundaries. It was fought on fronts, in battles, in places that soldiers went to die while civilians endured. The B-29 erased that line. When it appeared above a city, distance meant nothing, and safety ceased to exist. For the first time, mankind understood that its greatest danger came not from the soldier with a rifle, but from the sky itself. This realization changed international law, military ethics, and even architecture. Cities began to plan for dispersal shelters and evacuation routes. Nations created air defense networks that wrapped the planet in radar and missiles. Every technological breakthrough since, and from satellites to stealth, has carried the same echo. Control the sky, or perish beneath it. The burden of victory. For the men who flew the B-29, history recorded their triumph, but time revealed their burden. Many returned home as heroes, the embodiment of American might. Yet years later, when interviewed in quiet living rooms and veterans' halls, their voices softened. They spoke of pride in their aircraft, but rarely of joy. Captain Lawrence Madsen, a bombardier who flew over Osaka, once said, "When I saw the city burn, I thought, this is the end of something. Not just Japan, a something in us, too." His words mirror those of countless airmen who realized, even as the fires raged, that they had crossed a moral frontier from which humanity could not retreat. Technology had given them the power of gods, and the weight of guilt that came with it. From ruin to renewal. In the years following Japan's surrender, the same cities that once burned became laboratories for rebirth. American engineers who had destroyed factories now helped rebuild them. Japanese technicians who had crafted engines for Zero fighters began designing parts for radios, then for automobiles, then for the world's first transistor electronics. By the 1960s, Tokyo glittered again, neon lights replacing the glow of incendiaries. The nation that had been broken by air power became a leader in the very technologies that defined the modern age. And perhaps that, too, was part of the B-29's legacy, not only as an agent of destruction, but as the harbinger of transformation. Lessons in the sky. Every generation revisits the question of the B-29 with fresh eyes. Was it a necessary evil, or the first warning of a civilization too powerful for its own morality? The truth, as history often shows, lies in both. The Superfortress ended one of humanity's darkest wars, but it also revealed how easily human progress can outpace human wisdom. Its engines roared with the sound of modernity, but its bombs spoke the language of ancient fire. Even now, when stealth bombers glide silently above the clouds, they carry the DNA of that 1940s machine, its precision, its endurance, its promise and peril. Every radar echo and every contrail across the stratosphere traces back to those first silver wings over Japan. The sky after fire. At war's end, a Japanese poet named Tamiki Hara, a survivor of Hiroshima, wrote, "The sky is too wide, too beautiful. It has forgotten what it did." His words capture the essence of the B-29's legacy, and that beauty and terror often share the same horizon. The Superfortress remains a masterpiece of human engineering and a monument to human consequence. Its shadow teaches that victory without reflection is hollow, and that progress without restraint leads inevitably to ruin. What remains today, a handful of B-29s still exist. Some rest in museums, their polished fuselages reflecting the faces of visitors who look upon them in awe. One named Fifi still flies, its engines echoing across air shows in the United States. When those engines start, veterans and historians alike pause. For some, it is nostalgia, for others, reverence. But for all, it is a reminder that this machine once carried not only bombs, but the weight of the 20th century itself. Above all else, the B-29 reminds us of a truth carved into the silence after the war, that the sky, once humanity's symbol of freedom, became the final battlefield of conscience. The fires of Tokyo have long since cooled. The cities are rebuilt, the skies are calm, and the B-29 rests in history. Yet its story endures, not as a tale of glory, but as a mirror held to the face of mankind, reflecting what we are capable of when fear, genius, and necessity collide. Because in the smoke above Japan, the world glimpsed its future, and it burned brighter than anyone could bear.